I want to welcome today's speaker, Henri Barkey, who we are honored to host for the advertised talk, Turkey After the Coup Attempt, Costly Domestic Consequences and International Challenges. Now, it was in late spring of this year, early summer, when we decided to organize an event on Turkey, and we sort of looked through our Rolodex, and the name Henri Barkey was at the top of the list, and so we extended an invitation to him. It was only a few months later, on July the 15th, as most of you will know, when there was an attempted coup d'etat in Turkey, raising the importance of this topic and of this country to sort of new levels. It was announced a few days after the coup attempt on July 15th that the alleged mastermind of the coup attempt was the director of a Middle East program based in Washington, D.C., who the Turkish government identified and labeled as the key protagonist for allegedly masterminding that coup attempt. And that person is none other than our guest speaker tonight, this afternoon, Henri Barkey. So the importance of this topic is actually double. Not only is Turkey an important country, but now Henri Barkey's personal story is very much caught up in the drama of contemporary Turkish politics, and I'm hoping that he might say something about that in his remarks this afternoon, and if he doesn't, we surely will ask him about it. In terms of his formal title and resume, Henri Barkey is the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars in Washington, D.C. He served as a member of the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Staff, working primarily on issues related to the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean from 1998 to 2000. He's the former Bernard and Bertha Cohen Professor and Chair of International Relations at Lehigh University. His publications include Reluctant Neighbor, Turkey's Role in the Middle East, Turkey and the Arab Spring, Implications for Turkish Foreign Policy from a Transatlantic Perspective, and Turkey's Kurdish Question. His articles and commentaries have appeared in Foreign Policy, The National Interest, The American Interest, Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Politico, Financial Times, and other publications. And he's also a frequent guest on the PBS NewsHour, NPR, and on other media outlets. Our discussant for today is Joseph Silowitz, professor here at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies, a Turkey expert in his own right, where he's taught courses on the Middle East and democratization for several decades. He's an affiliate member of our Center for Middle East Studies, and he's also the president of the Denver Council on Foreign Relations. For those who are interested, Henri Barkey will also be speaking tomorrow late afternoon downtown Denver for the World Denver organization. If you're interested in hearing him, go to their website. You need to register, and you can hear him speak again. The format for our event this afternoon will follow the traditional format that our center has used in the past. Our keynote speaker will speak for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. Our discussant will comment on the keynote speaker's remarks for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will go to a question and answer session. The late Richard Holbrooke once described Turkey as the most important, strategically important country in the world. And I can't think of a better person today to help us interpret internal Turkish politics, where Turkey is headed in the foreseeable future, and what this all means for Turkish-American relations at this point in time, than our keynote speaker, Dr. Henri Barkey. Please join me in welcoming him to the Korbel School. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. I wish my parents were alive to hear your introduction. I mean, they would be very happy. I have to say I'm very actually honored to be at the Korbel School, because I spent two of my best years of my life was working at the State Department for Madeleine Albright in the policy planning staff, and has been always an admirer of hers. And she gave me a lot of interesting stuff to do, and so I owe her a lot. So to be here is actually a real treat. So yeah, I'm not planning, if you have questions, I can talk about my role, such as it is in the coup attempt. All I was doing was running a workshop, not even on Turkey. It was about Iran and its neighbors, and I did it in Turkey because, hey, I like to go back there, and also because it's easy to get people from the region to come there. And then the government went crazy. But So, look, on the 15th of July, rogue elements of the Turkish military attempted a coup and they failed. And let's face it, this was not the first time the Turkish military has acted. They've had, depending how you count, 4 successful direct and indirect coups, 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997. There are also 2, most people don't know, 2 failed attempts in 1962 and 1963. And for the most part, the Turkish military has had a great deal of influence in the Turkish political system. I would argue that probably until 2007, they were really the power behind the throne. But a lot of us who watch Turkey and have worked on the military kind of assume, myself included, that the days of the Turkish military were over, that they had actually lost to the current government of Mr. Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party, and especially in 2007 when they tried to block the then foreign minister from becoming the president of Turkey because his wife covered her hair. Everybody thought that this was it. And in fact, the night of the coup on the island I was at, there are no cars. You have to get a boat to get there, obviously, and only horse-drawn carriages and bicycles. So it's not as if you have a lot of activity. All I saw was one fire engine without its sirens going around. But so when I heard of the stuff going on in Istanbul, my immediate assumption was, there's some terrorist incident or there's a counterterrorism operation going on. Not in a million years would I have thought it was a coup, because I thought the military had been defeated. But it is, so let me start by what I would like to do today is kind of look, first of all, at the coup and then its immediate, shall we say, repercussions, but look at the long-term repercussions, both in terms of domestic politics and international politics. And what do we know about the coup? I would argue we don't know much. We don't know much. We know some of the basics. The coup started at 9 p.m. Some people say 10 p.m. That's not when you do coups. I mean, everybody knows if you want a coup, you do it at 3 a.m. in the morning when everybody's sleeping, the roads are clear. And so clearly what happened was that the coup had been discovered, so they start the operations earlier. But by 1 a.m. in the morning, the coup had fizzled out. And mop-up operations had started. But what was very interesting about this coup, which was also unlike other coups, was that for the first time, those involved in the coup engaged in really wanton violence against civilians, institutions. They killed civilians who tried to block them. And they also bombed the Turkish parliament. This is something the Turkish military had never done before. And I still, to this day, don't understand why they had to use this kind of violence. Was it the frustration of the coup, was the failure of the coup? But the point is, this was a different coup. And in a way, it also explains some of the traumatic reaction that you see in the aftermath of the coup and why Erdogan has managed to garner so much support, because A, there was resistance, and B, the officers and the soldiers, or putschists, I should say, reacted so violently. I'll talk about a few things about the Turkish military and civilians in a little while. But immediately, on the day after, Erdogan blamed the Fethullah Gülen organization and his acolytes for organizing the coup. And then immediately what we saw is the beginning of a great purge. A purge of not only the military, purge of the bureaucracy, purge of academia, purge of the press. And let me just talk about the officer. Something like 149 generals, that is 1 star, 2 stars, and all the way to 4 stars, were dismissed or arrested. That represents 46% of all Turkish generals, and admirals. I mean, which is an astounding number, right? 46% of all the generals, which creates a little bit of doubts in people's mind about it. Nobody believes, and I'll talk about the Gulen movement in a minute, nobody believes that you could have 146 generals be members of this shadowy communitarian organization. It's very difficult to infiltrate the Turkish military, even if some of them were Gülenists, but that number is huge. Then, in addition to that, another 4,000 officers and some non-commissioned officers were colonels, majors, etc., were also dismissed. So the Turkish military essentially has had a shock. In fact, so many pilots have been dismissed because for some reason there were a lot of pilots who participated in this coup, that you now have a real serious shortage of pilots for the Turkish Air Force. Usually you have, for every aircraft, you have 1.5 pilots. Now for every aircraft to fly, there's 0.7 pilots. So the Turkish military is now sending messages to Turkish Airlines pilots, say, please come back, because a lot of them are former officers. But so the most important thing is that since the coup to today is that you've had this enormous purge. The government has announced an emergency law, and that allows them to do whatever they want. You can arrest anybody, you can ban any organization you want, and you don't need to go through any process that you and I would recognize. And even yesterday, for example, they announced that 13,000 police officers had been dismissed, of which 2,500 are senior members of the police. So it's not just the military, but also other security services that are also have been hit. The Kurdish opposition has borne the brunt of this of these purges, even though the Kurds in no way were part of this coup attempt. You see that in Kurdish areas, for instance, large numbers of teachers have been dismissed. In the town of Diyarbakir, for instance, which is the heartland of Turkey's Kurdish region, the most Kurdish city, if you want, the biggest Kurdish city in the world, 4,000 school teachers were dismissed overnight, and just at the beginning of the school year. Right? So you don't have teachers now to teach classes. But the number of nationwide, the number of teachers who have been fired is about 15,000. TV stations, radio stations. Yesterday, a whole series of TV stations went off the air with the police coming in and closing them down, confiscating their equipment. There are lots of journalists who are now in jail. To be precise, 125 journalists, but also academics, intellectuals. A lot of my friends are in jail, people I know quite well, and a friend of mine, well, I should say acquaintance, not really a friend, I had dinner with on July 2nd, is now one of the most important intellectuals in jail, by a guy by the name of Ahmet Altan, sorry. The newspapers have been closed. So when you look today at the Turkish press, like I do every day, I mean, I look at all the front pages of all the Turkish newspapers, I would say that 90% of the Turkish press is either directly under the control of the government or indirectly under the control of the government. And they do not dare to criticize. In fact, more than that, the rest, the 10% that is supposedly the opposition that they tolerate now at the moment, and I don't know how long they will tolerate them, are not, except for maybe 1 or 2 papers, are not very significant. And those who are now part of this government conglomerate of newspapers, or I should say, influence network, every day you can tell that, just like in the Soviet Union, messages are being sent, this is what you're going to cover, this is what you're going to say. You end up with the same stories on the front pages, the same pictures, and also the same ludicrous claims of horrible stuff that the Fethullah Gülen organization has done, and or others, the United States, etc. So, so you have essentially an atmosphere in Turkey now that is actually very, very different than a couple of years ago. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Fethullah Gülen organization and why these two behemoths, Erdogan's political party, Erdogan himself, and Fethullah Gülen are at odds now. So you have to understand the Justice and Development Party of Mr. Erdogan essentially rose out of the ashes of the Islamist movement in Turkey in the 1990s. And Erdogan and about 6 or 7 leading Islamist politicians, and Erdogan had been the mayor of Istanbul, and a very successful mayor of Istanbul, decided to break with their mother party, and because they thought it was too radical, too Islamist, and they were going to offer an alternative that was more democratic, more appealing to Europe, more appealing to the intelligentsia in Turkey, more appealing to the liberal parts of and in fact, it was a very successful message. And look, I remember meeting Erdogan in beginning of 2002, end of 2001, a year before the elections that would carry him to power. He came to Washington, and a friend of mine and I were invited to have dinner with him. And he was trying to explain his party. And I have to say, I was very, very impressed with him. I mean, he was saying all the right things. Not only that, so we're sitting at a table, you know, my friend and I, again, you know, and he's sitting across from us, and there's another table, like the kiddie table, right, with his advisors. And, you know, he would say something, and one of his advisors would chime from there and say, oh, Mr. President, he's the president of the party, you know, you said this, but in actual fact, it's this. And he would turn around and say, yeah, you know what, you're right. And so, hey, you're not used to Turkish politicians, you know, having people from the kiddie tables essentially tell you what is right and what is wrong. And I thought that was quite refreshing. Of course, today, not only you don't have a kiddie table, but everybody around him are yes men, and they're all men, by the way, and they basically repeat everything he says, and he doesn't have anything. But it's been an amazing transformation. I'll talk about this. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that it was a very powerful message. And in fact, he did win the Turkish elections of 2002 with 34% of the vote. But given the crazy Turkish political system, where you have a 10% threshold to get into parliament, only 2 parties made it into parliament. So he ended up with almost 2/3 of the seats in parliament and eventually would become the prime minister. And the first 5 years of his rule was actually, again, just like he had promised, liberal, opening to Europe, opening to domestic constituencies. But here's the thing. Erdogan is a very good politician. And he had been the mayor of Istanbul, and you have to understand the mayor of Istanbul is a microcosm of the whole country, because every part of Turkey is represented in Istanbul. So he has, and if you're the mayor of Istanbul, you're really the mayor of Turkey in many ways. But he also had to manage a very complicated city, and he needed good personnel for that. It is one thing to have good personnel in Istanbul, but when he became prime minister, he needed cadres for his government. And there were cadres in the Turkish political system, but they were all Kemalists. They were all from the people he did not trust. So he turned around and looked for cadres. And the person who provided the cadres for him was this guy called Fethullah Gülen. Fethullah Gülen is this religious leader who created, because in Turkey the Kemalists were always suppressed religious movements, he kind of created, he with others, I mean, created lots of these, what the Turks call cemiyets, which are organizations, if you want, or associations that kind of skirted the attention of the Kemalist establishment in the military. The military was very much aware of them, but could tolerate them. Fethullah Gülen was kind of unique among them in the sense that his organization had invested a great deal in education. Right? So the people who were affiliated with him were much better educated. So you see the beginning of an alliance between Erdogan, the prime minister, and Gülen, the leader of this. Mind you, Gülen by that time has already left Turkey. He's in the United States. Right? He was already, because he was worried that he was going to be arrested. He came to the United States, first to Virginia, eventually to Pennsylvania. But he was participating, obviously, from where he was. So you had an alliance whereby he offered his cadres and Erdogan took them. So the Fethullah Gulen that Erdogan is wailing about and he's calling a terrorist and wants the United States to send back was his ally. And it's when he purges, and 100,000 people have been purged from the government, from the bureaucracy today in Turkey since July 15th. Right? So what is it, 2 months, 3 months? 100,000 people have been purged. All of these, he claims, are Gülenists. But they were all people that were invited in. They did not infiltrate the state bureaucracy. They were invited in. And when they were in, they created their own sphere of influence. And the Gülenists had their own agenda. They had an agenda. And for the longest part, that agenda and Mr. Erdogan's agenda were identical. It was anti-military, anti-Kemalist, the official kind of ideology of the state, and initially anti-Kurdish. The break between the two emerged around 2012 when Erdogan, to his credit, decided that the Kurdish problem in Turkey could not be resolved, and I'll talk about this later, could not be resolved militarily, and that he needed a diplomatic option. And Gülen, for reasons that are a little bit mysterious to me, is ferociously anti-Kurdish. That's the beginning of the break, when his people in the bureaucracy started to object to Erdogan's efforts at trying to figure out a non-military solution to the Kurdish problem. And in fact, Erdogan traveled a long distance and initiated even talks with the PKK, the organization that the United States and Turkey consider a terrorist organization, and they even had a deal. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But to his credit, I mean, he went the furthest that any Turkish politician had gone. Now he's completely reversed himself. That's another matter. But this is Erdogan. He can do. But so that's how the split started. So Erdogan retaliated at Gülen's efforts to block his Kurdish initiative by closing off one of Gülen's most lucrative operations, which are special classes that are designed to get students to prepare for the university exams, etc. But the Gülen organization, I should say this, I mean, not only they provided the cadres for the bureaucracy, but they also created a formidable, especially under a friendly government of Mr. Erdogan, a international and national presence in Turkey that was very, very impressive. Lots of business. I mean, they created their own business organization, business association. Very, very large businesses in Turkey were affiliated with the movement. And it was all open. They had their newspapers, they had their television stations, and they went on a huge expansion of schools. And this is very important to understand. They built up schools in not every country, but in many, many countries in the world, including the United States. A lot of charter schools in this country were established by the Gülen movement. This is a movement that believes in teaching science, teaching math, teaching English. So especially when they went to the third world, in places like Tanzania, Uganda, right? The Turkish government actually encouraged them, and the Turkish government eventually, even interceded on their behalf with those governments. And what you see, ironically, is that the Turkish government's influence after those schools are established also increases. Why? Because these schools are very good schools. The elite sends their kids there. So then you have an entree to the elites. Once you have an entree to the elites, then you can bring your own business association, your businesses who operate in Turkey, whether it's in construction or textiles or whatever, you start getting contracts in those countries, right? And you start making money. Right? It's a formidable, very ingenious business model of sorts. I mean, through education, right, you create this network. And the Turkish government was 100% behind that. Oops, I have to move quickly. All right, so this was hand in glove, the two. But you had this escalatory ladder of confrontation between the two. And as I said, Erdogan retaliated. But what you do see, ultimately. This is a power struggle between two very powerful groups. Right? And it is very clear that at some point in Turkey, the two could not coexist at the same time because there were both of them were exceedingly powerful. And there had to be a confrontation because, if you are kind of the emperor, you don't want another emperor in your midst, right? And Erdogan wanted to, eventually would want to eliminate. And the Gulen movement went at the end of 2013, to show you how well they were infiltrated in the bureaucracy. I mean, the people they had put in the bureaucracy published or leaked tapes of conversations in between Erdogan and his son, where Erdogan says to his son, the police is coming, hide the money. I mean, very amazingly incriminating stuff. And once that came out, Erdogan went on a full-scale, shall we say, denial campaign, went after Gulen. I mean, now it was complete war, right? And for all intents and purposes, he succeeded in suppressing what would have been investigations of all these tapes that had been released because there was a lot of corruption. I mean, 4 ministers lost their jobs, but nothing happened to Erdogan. The ministers did not go to jail. I mean, those guys were making really huge amounts of money from contracts. Anyway, so this is a work. And you can look at maybe the coup attempt as Gülen's last hurrah. Now, I don't know to what extent the Gülen movement was involved in the coup. I mean, the Turkish press says it. Everybody in Turkey says it. Erdogan says it from morning to night. Erdogan wants Gülen to be extradited, and he's very angry at Obama for not doing it. Not that Obama can do it, but anyway. Is it that there are Gülenist elements in the coup? Absolutely. But I can't believe that 149 generals were part of the Gülen movement. There's something else going on. And we don't, because today the press is not free anymore in Turkey, there's nobody doing the investigations. So you have all these lurid stories emerging and that the people buy because they don't have a choice, but you can't tell by reading the Turkish press what happened. To me, it's also weird that the number of soldiers who participated in the coup were 10,000. You can't, 149 generals for 10,000 soldiers? 46% of your generals for an army that is 500,000 strong? And only 10,000 participated? Things don't make sense. But I don't know. There is circumstantial evidence, I would say, that Gülen was involved. I mean, I can make the case that he was involved, but not him personally, maybe his acolytes. But we don't know that, and we will never find out. Right? Because this government is doing its utmost to essentially also eliminate any kind of evidence that can be used. Because there may be Kemalist officers who don't like Erdogan. There may be also officers that knew that they were going to be being forced to retire come August and decided, you know what, I'm going to join this because, hey, this is my last chance to remain. I don't know. Right? I don't know. And I don't think I will ever find out unless the U.S. government finds out and somebody leaks from the U.S. government sources. Okay, so let me talk about the repercussions, the domestic and international repercussions. Domestic, I mean, the obvious thing, the most obvious one is that Turkey is becoming increasingly an authoritarian place. But what kind of an authoritarian place? Turkey has never been really democratic, right? You always had this state authority that always was above you, watched you, made sure that you didn't deviate too much. I mean, gave you some freedom. But this is different. The previous one was very ideological, this military Kemalist ideology that was imposed. I don't know what is now going to replace that. At the moment, it looks like what Weber would call charismatic authority. Power is now coming from essentially one person, right? Erdogan. He controls his party, he controls the bureaucracy, he now controls the military. I mean, he has his hands everywhere. And the guy, you have to understand, he's amazingly good. Sometimes I think of him as somebody who sits and has a bank of 100 TV screens and he's watching everything at the same time and giving orders. I mean, he's very, very good. right? I mean, one should never, never underestimate him. But he also has managed to convince a large segment of the Turkish population that power resides with him. But in reality, he's the president of Turkey. And in Turkey, the president doesn't have executive powers. It's the prime minister and parliament that has it. And in fact, parliament now is irrelevant, right? And he, again, without real authority, but his sheer personality and his ability to convince people that he is the leader, right? He's now running the country. But it's not constitutional. So he's probably going to go for constitutional change to essentially, he was planning to do that for a long time, even before the coup, and to essentially legitimize and turn Turkey into a presidential system of some sort, maybe like ours, maybe like the French, in terms of the institutions. But clearly, now, but it's still going to be one person. And I think that's probably not sustainable in the long run, this new regime that is only, because he's still human, last time I checked, right? And so is he going to introduce a new ideology? And that's the interesting thing. You're starting to see hints of a anti-Western, more Islamist, but more Sunni rhetoric coming out of Erdogan. Every day he's saying certain things that gives you a hint of what he's thinking. So the Erdogan I met back in 2001 and the Erdogan of today are completely two different people. In the process, I think what happened is that, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, as he became, as he won election after election, right, he realized, and the Turkish opposition, except for the Kurdish party, is completely hapless. He could do whatever he wanted. So after a while, he realized that he can go back to his own, maybe factory settings, because he started off as a hardcore Islamist, and that's where he might be taking the country. I'm not saying Turkey is going to be, Saudi Arabia or Sharia state or even Iran, but it is going to be a far more pious, officially pious, and he's chipping away every day. He's chipping away at Atatürk and the Atatürk's legacy. The other day, he challenged one of the most important tenets of the Turkish Republic, the Treaty of Lausanne, that drew the boundaries of Turkey back in 1923. So he said, Lausanne was a disaster. Sounds like Trump, but that Lausanne was a disaster, and therefore, Turkey has to rethink those boundaries. He said that the Lausanne Treaty gave away islands to Greece. Actually, the islands were given to Greece before 2 or 3 years before the Lausanne Treaty. The point is, he's challenging the Atatürk legacy. Right? Every day, there's little things, small things. Right? My favorite one was, Atatürk has been this idol, this god in Turkey. His mausoleum is probably one of the most sacred places in Turkey, right? What did they do the other day? They put the children, those ugly plastic, colorful, slides and stuff like that. Out of the blue, one day you woke up and they had this at the mausoleum, in front of the mausoleum. I mean, again, it was to me, it was another dig at the old man. But the problem is that, this is, Turkey becoming more authoritarian is going to become is problematic not only in terms of democracy, etc., but you're seeing a major brain drain because so many academics have been fired, and more will be fired as time goes on. You have people leaving Turkey, business elites going. He's also replacing the traditional Turkish business elite, and I'm not trying to define the Turkish business elite, with his own elite that gets all the government contracts. So if you want a part of the new airport or part of the new bridge or part of the new railroad that's being built, and there's a lot of infrastructure development going on in Turkey, Nadir is going to kill me. But right? You had to be back. So he's replacing the traditional business elite that was essentially a Kemalist elite with his own. So this is transformation going on. Again, it's a little bit too early to tell, but the two big issues for him is one, the economy, and I'm not going to go into that, but the other one is the Kurdish issue. The Kurdish issue, as I said, he actually did a lot of progress on the Kurdish issue, but it all collapsed because of what's happening in Syria. The Syrian crisis, because of what the Kurds are doing in Syria, that essentially brought down the Kurdish peace initiative in Turkey. He actually, there was a deal that was signed, a roadmap between the Kurds and the Turkish government, and he abrogated it because he wanted the PKK to stop the advance of the Syrian Kurds. The Syrian Kurds in Turkey, for the Turkish Kurds, are today the most important. I can go in question and answers on that. Most important aspect. I mean, they really care about what happens in Syria, more than maybe what happens even in their own country, and that's another question. So the PKK refused, and Erdogan essentially abrogated the agreement, and now you've had a war going on between the Kurds but as you see, this purge is affecting the Kurds a lot more in some ways. The big danger is that there will be an uprising by the Kurds, not so much in the traditional Kurdish areas of Turkey in the southeast and east, but in the big cities. Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in the world, has 2 to 4 million Kurds. Adana and Mersin are two cities that have enormous number of refugees from the 1990s from the Kurdish areas because of the war, and they are very radical and very angry. So you may have, that may be, in a way, the Achilles heel of the Turkish government. Quickly, a couple of words on foreign repercussions. Look, the Turks have always been very anti-Western, anti-American, in part because the Kemalist educational system always blamed the West for what happened to the Ottoman Empire. So you kind of socialize into that. But Erdogan has now taken this to another level, in part because, and it was always like that, but the coup has made it even more intense. There's a lot of people, and I'm starting to become one of them, that think that Erdogan really believes that the United States was behind the coup. If you read his press, there's no question. Every day the Turkish press that's pro Erdogan openly say United States, Britain, the Rothschilds, all kinds, even great American Civil War leaders. I mean, you hear such conspiracy theories, but always the message is the same. They're trying to block us. They're jealous of us. It's mostly against Turkey, but it's mostly also against the rising of an Islamic power. That will have a very serious impact on Turkish-American relations and Turkish-European relations, in the sense that there really is a chill today. The chill has to do with the fact that we're not sending Gülen back, but it's also because of these accusations. It's the fact that they don't trust us, but it's also about Syria, where we now support the Syrian Kurds against ISIS, and the Turks are up in arms about that, and they think that this is part of the great betrayal of. But the anti-Western feelings that are now becoming so much more prevalent in Turkey, and if really they start believing that the United States was behind the coup, you will see that Turkish policy in time will change with that. And it is to some extent changing. And it's going to bring up many more confrontations. I do know, by the way, that Vice President Biden, in his conversation with Erdogan the other day, did manage to introduce, and I think it wasn't strong enough, but said, look, you need to be careful about this anti-Americanism, because if something happens to an American in Turkey, there's going to be a major fallout in the United States. The Turks are still part of NATO, right? They're also technically a candidate country for the European Union. But it is going to become more and more difficult for the Europeans. I mean, I think the European project of Turkey is dead, but the Europeans are pretending it's not. But at some point, both because of the repression at home and also because of the rhetoric. You'll find that Europeans and the Turks are going to go their own distance, and we're seeing the same thing with the United States. NATO, Turkey is not going to be kicked out of NATO, but it can be at one point be suspended. Right? There is, but at the moment, the United States needs Turkey, and that's why the United States is not saying anything about the human rights violations, or even, as I said, the rhetoric against America, because we use the bases. We need Turkish cooperation in Syria. Turkey is the most important country when it comes to the future of Syria. There's this geography, we cannot. But I think the test is going to be, and I'll finish with this, of the future of Turkish-American relations will be Syria, and to a certain extent, Mosul. Erdogan already said the other day he won't accept anybody going to Mosul. In Mosul, you have to have Sunni Arabs and Sunni Kurds and Turkomans. Again, the use of Sunni for the first time like this in foreign policy is kind of interesting. But most importantly, we have made our bed with the Syrian Kurds because they are the only force in Syria that can take on ISIS. And despite all the pressure, and I should tell you this story. The Turkish-American relationship took a hit in October 2014 when ISIS decided to go after the town of Kobani. Kobani is a small town in the Turkish-Syrian border, Kurdish town, not strategically important for us, really. But what happened was ISIS, which was just fresh out of its successes in northern Iraq, in Mosul, etc., for reasons that people don't understand, decided to show all the armaments that they had captured from the Iraqi army, brand new American tanks and stuff like that, and then put everything to take the town of Kobani. And somebody, I think, at the Pentagon watching this said to the White House, look, there are hundreds of tanks there, our tanks, but except they're in the hands of ISIS, going towards Kobani. This is a chance to destroy them. And it turns out most of the Obama's advisors said, don't do anything, don't do anything. The Turks are going to be upset. And for reasons that, unusual, counterintuitive move that Obama did, he said, no, we'll go after them. Because ISIS, for him, ISIS is such a big threat. And the United States bombed the hell out of the ISIS formations, and with the Syrian Kurds, pushed back ISIS there. It was the first big success for the Syrian Kurds as well. And that's how the alliance between the United States and Turkey and the Syrian Kurds started. And for Erdogan, that was the beginning of the break. This was even before the coup. So let's say 2 years before the coup, that's where the break between the United States started. And the coup is essentially what convinces him that maybe we did it. This because of Syria, that's why. And let me stop here. And excuse me for taking longer than I expected.
Thank you. Let me just make a couple of points and perhaps raise a couple of issues that should be addressed either by you by asking questions, or perhaps our speaker would like to respond. The first point that I'd like to make is that the crackdown by Erdogan really began before the July 15th coup. There is a history here, and I'm personally involved in that history because part of it involves a petition that was signed by a large number of Turkish academics urging the government to rethink its policies towards the southeast, specifically the Kurds. The crackdown was vicious. Academics lost their jobs. Academics were had charges brought against them, and so on. And I happen to know this personally because a couple of colleagues of mine have been directly affected. And of course, things have gotten much worse since the coup. And the question is, where is Turkey really heading? Because you have a situation where even before the coup, public opinion surveys that were done in January of 2016 by the German Marshall Fund and by Kadir Has University revealed the extent to which you had very deep, profound polarization within the country. there was increasing segregation between those who supported Erdogan, those who supported the GHP, for example. One group didn't want to live next to the other group. One group didn't want it to have friends even with the other group. And now, of course, this entire environment is, on the one hand, deteriorating, but on the other hand, you also have this sense of unity that was created by the July 15th revolution. And the key question is, in what direction will Turkey go? On the one hand, you can have the vision of Erdogan as a charismatic leader, wielding all the power. But as was pointed out, that has all kinds of inherent problems. So even though he may get support from the GHP and the MHP, the other two major parties, for some changes in the constitution, nevertheless, the question remains, how long will this show of national unity prevail? Because it's a veneer, it seems to me, over this profound polarization. Now, it's conceivable that Erdogan could turn back to be the Erdogan of 2002 to 2007, but that strikes me as being unlikely. There's another factor that's involved that Professor Barkey touched on, and that is the economy. He mentioned the extent to which the existing business elite was being replaced by a new business elite. Well, obviously, that's going to create additional social tensions. And in fact, the shape of the economy as a whole should be a major concern, because there were already signs before the coup that the economy wasn't doing too well. And since the coup, Moody's, for example, has issued a credit rating of junk for Turkey's bonds. Now, if you have a deteriorating economy, what impact will that have upon Erdogan's attempts to monopolize power and to rule dictatorially? So there are all kinds of issues concerning the domestic scene that remain to be dealt with, and we don't know how Erdogan is going to be dealing with them. He really has two options. One is build on the unity that has been achieved as a result of the coup, and perhaps soften his stance. The other possibility is to rule as a charismatic authoritarian dictator. Now, all of this, of course, again, has tremendous implications for the international scene. Turkey has always had three arenas in which it wants to play. The first, obviously, is the Middle East itself, with the Arab states, Syria, Iran, Iraq, the Gulf states, and so on. The second involves Russia and Central Asia, because remember, Turkey originated really in Central Asia, and has close ties with countries like Azerbaijan and so forth. And the third, and today is opening up, trying to reach to China. And third, of course, you have its relations with the EU, with NATO, with the West, with the United States, and so on. And it's always been a difficult task to balance the relationships between these three groups. It's tried to have this no problems with neighbors policy, which was an abject failure. It's now reopened relations with Russia, apologized for downing that Russian plane, has tried to establish better relations once again with Israel, and so forth. And you have the whole business with Syria and Iraq, Mosul, and so on. And all of this, however, presents tremendous challenges for the United States. What should the United States do under these circumstances, given what is going on in Turkey, given the problems with the Kurds in Syria and elsewhere, and so on? Imagine for a moment if Erdogan closed the key base of Incirlik near Adana, which we use to support the efforts that are going on in Syria and in Iraq. So the question really remains, what should the United States do? As was pointed out, we are blamed for the coup. The CIA is held as being at least partly, if not wholly, responsible for working with Gulen. And the question really is, to what extent should we turn a blind eye to what goes on domestically in Turkey because of the strategic interests that we have, which are really of great importance? And similarly, the EU faces a similar challenge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Henri and to Joe. I struggle to think of another event that we've hosted here where the insight and the analysis has been as substantive as we've just been exposed to. So now we have time for questions and answers. If you have a question, please line up at the microphone, and I ask you to keep your questions as succinct and as cogent as possible, and we'll get to as many of them as possible.
Do you see Turkey eventually just leaving NATO because of populist sentiment at any time soon, sort of like how our relationship with the Philippines is deteriorating at the moment? And what are the implications for their relationship with Russia in the future, especially over the actions in Syria and breaking the recent ceasefire?
Look, for all the bluster that Erdogan and company say about the United States, NATO, and the West in general, the truth is there's a way in which there is no alternative to the West for them. I mean, let's face it. When was the last time a Turk bought an iPhone made in Russia? Or a Lada, right? This is a Russian car, in case you don't know. Right? I mean, let's face it. I mean, the West is where, should we say, all the goodies are, in more ways than one. I mean, even the most Islamist of the elite will still go to Europe to shop rather than anywhere else. So I actually think that there are other serious interests why they do not want to move away from NATO. But I would not say that it is impossible, only because if this distancing continues at the current rate and there's no end to it, there is almost a logical point a little bit where some people may say it's time. I mean, there are a lot of people in Turkey who say it's time to leave NATO, but I still think the chances are small, but I would not say it's not impossible. But Russia, just one word about, look, the Turkish-Russian relationship has always been fraught with animosity. I mean, we shouldn't look at what's going on now and think that there's going to be a real new love affair between Putin and Erdogan, in that, one, on Syria, they're on opposite sides, and that's very, very important. And remember that the Turks entered NATO because the Russians coveted Turkish territory. When you live next to a bear, and that's probably the only major reason why the Turks will not leave NATO. When you live with a bear next to you, you do look for another bear to protect you. And the Turks cannot, if you look at Russian behavior, you will see that Russian behavior, given how pushy it is, to put it mildly, is something that the Turks would not appreciate in a long time. So I still think Turkey is going to stay in NATO. The question is, will NATO at some point say, NATO did at one point put the Greek colonels on suspension. Would something like that happen? Maybe.
No, I just want to add another point on the Russian-Turkish relationship. one key area of concern that has arisen in recent days is the Black Sea. And the Turks certainly do not want to see the Black Sea as a Russian lake. And that has led to some discord between the two.
Hi, my name is Harry Smythe. Thank you both for the wonderful talk. My question is, in the events following the coup, Fethullah Gulen in The Guardian and then again on CNN suggested the coup may have been staged, part of Erdogan's attempt to consolidate power. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on whether that was likely to be true or if it even made sense.
No, you mean the coup being staged by Erdogan to Erdogan this is being what, clever by a half, too clever by a half. But it is really, you don't. It was very risky. No, I don't believe so. I mean, it is clear that had the officers captured him, he would have been dead by now.
How do you believe Erdogan will respond to the massive brain drain that has been caused by, imprisoning 4,000 teachers? Like, what institutional policy will he implement, do you think?
Well, the brain drain is not, the teachers, 15,000 teachers which were dismissed, high school teachers, primary school teachers, etc. The brain drain really is one that affects university professors, think tankers, other intellectuals, people who think that they can no longer, either they've been fired, or they think they can no longer write what they want to do or research what they want to do, or even some business elites, business groups that are going to think about, or business persons who are going to think about they can't really do business in Turkey because the system is going to be stacked against them. There's a loyalty test now that is being introduced implicitly when people, if you want to get something from the government, right? And you have to prove that you were against the coup, you have to prove that you're pro-Erdogan, and it may not come from Erdogan himself, but it is his minions, his bureaucrats who want to show how loyal they are to Erdogan himself that are going to increasingly alienate people who are not thinking exactly the same way, which means that the brain drain is something, it's not something that Erdogan, I think personally would care about, only because it's eliminating people who would be his opponents at home anyway, right? So their positions are going to be taken over by people who are much loyal to him, right? In the long run, the people who moved, let's say, to the United States or to Europe, the two logical places, will become a source of consternation for him because they will oppose Erdogan's policies and lobby against Erdogan, whether it's the United States or in Europe.
Hi, thank you for joining us at the Corbell School. Thank you, Danny. You stated that it's an increasingly popular belief that the United States was behind the coup, and you are starting to see the merit in that idea. In what way would
No, I didn't say I see a merit behind it. I mean, I started thinking that, yes, I see that even Erdogan believes that, but there's no merit to that, please.
There isn't. Okay, so I was just wondering what could possibly be the benefit that the United States would have behind supporting a military coup in Turkey when there are so few politically stable countries in the region. And although Erdogan is not exactly a favorite head of state, he is a stable head of state.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I mean, on two levels, it makes no sense. I mean, given the importance of Turkey, you do not want political instability. And as you pointed out, there was political stability. You may not like what Erdogan does, but you did business with him, and people did business. I mean, so one. Two, look, the age of coups is something of the past. You do not want to encourage coups in Turkey or anywhere else because one coup begets another coup. And I think the United States, like everybody else, had assumed until now that the Turkish military was out of the coup business. And coups are amazingly problematic for the United States, because we can't support a military regime anymore. Maybe there were days when we did it. I'm not saying that the United States is completely blameless in the past, not in Turkey, but in other parts of the world, for coups or complicity. But in this day and age, in the 21st century, in the Barack Obama presidency, the idea that we would sanction a coup is completely preposterous because it creates such problems. And then we have to defend an illegitimate government, and we would have to do business with an illegitimate government. And that would have been very, very problematic. Now we're doing business with a government that really doesn't like us, but it's still legitimate.
Yeah. My name is Esra Dilek. I'm a visiting fellow from Turkey. And I have a question regarding your comments for the 2013 drift between Erdogan and Gülen. You mentioned that it was mainly because the peace process began in 2013, where the Gülenist establishment was anti-Kurd. So this is why the first drift began between the two parts. But we had a huge discussion on the presidential system also. The presidential system and the changing constitution, which I'd like to learn your thoughts about the situation in terms of Erdogan's will to become the president with specific powers in domestic politics. And we know that Fethullah Gülen also made a comment on that the clash began actually because Erdogan wanted to become the president in the way he wanted to. So I'd like to learn your thoughts about that.
The clash between the two actually started before 2013. It was really beginning of 2012, I believe, when there was an attempt by the police to arrest the head of the Turkish Secret Service because he was the one who was involved in the peace negotiations. Look, as I said in my comments, I do think that what you ended up with in Turkey was two very powerful forces that could not coexist because it was a zero-sum relationship, right? So that Gülen at some point probably saw Erdogan's attempt at creating a presidential system as something that was probably going to be dangerous for him. It's possible. But in 2010, you have to remember, there was a constitutional amendment that dealt with changing the judicial system, etc. At that time, the two worked so well together that the night of when the constitutional referendum passed, I remember distinctly watching Erdogan say and thanking Gülen by using a euphemism, saying, and we thank all those forces across the ocean that helped us, right? So there was, the two really were working together until 2012, 2030. But I agree with you that Gülen would not want to see Erdogan assume all those powers.
Thank you for your insights. I really enjoyed the talk. I have two questions. One is, how does one become a participant of the Gülen movement, or is it something dangerous to be participant of the Gülen movement? Are you becoming a terrorist or something like that? And the other question is, Heiko Bağdat, who is a very prominent Armenian-Turkish journalist, he gave a talk this week in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and he said there is no signs of betterment in Turkey at all.
There's no signs of what?
No betterment, improvement. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing all these human rights violations right now in Turkey. Concentration camps are being built, people are being tortured in prisons, people are found dead in prisons. So where are you seeing Turkey going domestically?
Look, I've never joined the Gülen movement, so I don't know how you become a member of the Gülen movement. I don't know if they issue little cards, laminated, and look, it's a faith-based organization. I mean, I think with the exception of his immediate cadres, the people who ran his newspapers, some of the businesses, most people will tell you, I'm not a Gülenist. what they will do is participate in meetings, give money to a cause that a Gulenist organization wants you to give one. Go to universities that Gulen, there were 15 universities that Gulen supposedly created, and they're all closed now. Read the Gulenist newspapers, watch Gulenist television stations, right? So it's a worldview. It's not necessarily an organization that is based on dues-paying membership. Right? So in that sense, it's very difficult to tell whether you're a Gulenist or she's a Gulenist. There's no way you can tell. I mean, do I know Gulenists? Yes, I know Gulenists, but they were mostly overt. So, I mean, Erdogan calls them a terrorist organization, which is, of course, problematic, but as a definition. But look at, I mean, he's very angry the United States is not extraditing him, right? And it's going to be very hard for the United States to extradite him for the very simple reason that all of these things are very difficult to prove. How do you prove that he was involved in the coup? Even if he was, I bet you there are no electronic trail, forget about paper trail, you won't find any electronic trail. He's not going to, there won't be any signs, right? So faith-based organizations work in a very different way than, let's say, a labor union or a teachers association or something like that. In terms of the situation getting worse, yes, I wouldn't call it concentration camps, but I mean, yes, people are going to jail. I mean, look, one very famous economist is now in jail because apparently the day before the coup, he sent subliminal messages on television for the coup. If that's the case, by the way, you don't know this, but I sent lots of subliminal messages when you were doing this lecture, right? I mean, it's like me being accused of the coup attempt. I mean, right? You can make up anything you want, but it is front page in the New York Times, in the Turkish press. I mean, look. I will give you one example from my case, which is actually hilarious. At least I think it's hilarious. So one newspaper decided to go really after me and my colleagues at this. So they splashed the names and the pictures of all the participants at my workshop. It was a small workshop. I mean, and then they put a picture of some guy called Scott Peterson. Now, Scott Peterson, as some of you may know, is a Christian Science Monitor correspondent for Middle East, especially Iran, and he's based in Istanbul. He's somebody I know very well, but I did not invite him. He came to the island to be there because, unbeknownst to me, he was engaged to one of my colleagues. But when I saw Scott, I liked Scott a lot. I said, yo, and he's an Iran expert. So this is about Iran. I said, you're going to stay and participate. I said, sure. But then the coup happened, he had to leave, etc. But when you look at, you see, because the Turkish police gave these journalists everything, all the details, they gave a list of the people who were there with all our affiliations. Because I didn't expect Scott, we put his name down because for the hotel, but we didn't put his affiliation. Okay. Let me ask you a question. If you Google Scott Peterson, what will come up? Do you know? On Google, the first thing that comes up. Do you remember in 2002, there was a case in California, Scott Peterson killed his wife, Lacey, right? So they Googled him. And they discovered Scott Peterson, who's in San Quentin under, I think, death sentence. And they put his picture on the paper, saying he was there. Right? And then when people started to make fun of this newspaper, they came back the next day with the same picture, said, no, we know Scott Peterson was there because I brought him there on the instructions of the US government because he was going to kill people in exchange for which he was going to be paroled from San Quentin. This is front page. This is a whole page. I mean, you realize that it's not serious anymore. I mean, it's humorous, but it's, believe me, given all the stuff I had to go through, it's not fun anymore. But this is the level of nonsense that is being said every day, right? So things are going to get worse. That's the answer.
I would like you to comment on something that I experienced. Years ago, I had a meeting with the then President Suleiman
Demirel.
Demirel, right. And afterwards, some of his ministers asked my opinion on Turkey joining the European Union. And I said, well, one, the European Union is going to be hesitant because you're a Muslim country. I said, and two, there was the Kurdish problem, how you were treating the Kurds. And these ministers said, we don't have a problem with the Kurds anymore. And I said, I don't know if you do or you don't, but perception is sometimes stronger than fact. And what I'm asking now is Turkey still interested in joining the European Union?
I have to tell you, this is a hard question to answer. I mean, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would say yes, unequivocally, yes. I don't know anymore. I mean, it may be because look, if you sense that they don't want you, after a certain point, you will stop wanting to be part of that group. So there is now increasingly a sense in Turkey that Turkey can go it alone, or that Turkey can create its own sphere of influence, and that Turkey is a great power. So this is becoming very prevalent, and so I think it's not inconceivable to me that the Turks will not want to. But remember, another question is that you don't become a member of the European Union without paying a price. As you pointed out, the Kurdish question being one of them, they have to solve that problem before they join the European Union. Is that? Yeah, I think Erdogan was interested in solving it, but for more complicated reasons, because of what was happening in Syria, he gave up on it. He may still go back to it after he thinks he has defeated the Kurds. He's not going to defeat the Kurds because it's too broad of a movement. So this problem is going to persist. But there are this issue of democracy. And as Turkey is constituted today, even if on economic terms it does all the right things, it can't go into the European Union because it violates all the basic principles of the European Union. So will Erdogan want to give up on all things? I think not.
Okay, thank you.
You recently talked about the issue regarding NATO, but if we look back to the Cyprus issue and we look in the 60s and 70s, we endured through that and Turkey remained a partner with NATO. Regarding that, we also saw significant anti-Americanism in Turkey. My impression was that that was the general population and that the government, Demirel we talked about already, protected the U.S. regarding that was more pro-U.S. The reversal seems to be the place right now. Do you get the impression that the general public in Turkey is anti-American, and that or do you think that the government itself under Erdogan is trying to construct an identity of unity that was mentioned before based off anti-Americanism, or is that going to be created via a different justification?
Look, I don't think it's a reverse of what you described earlier, which was you had an anti-American public, but you had an elite that was pro-American at the political level and that understood the realities. And remember also, that was years of the Cold War. It's not as if you had many choices, right? Today, what I would argue is that you've always had, as I said, because of the socialization process, the Kemalist socialization process, you've had this anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism that has been built into, if you want, people's consciousness. What Erdogan has done now, and what the Islamist movement has done, has added another layer to it. So if you want, the anti-Westernism is thicker than it used to be, right? The difference is not only that the fact that it's thicker, that now you have a government that is actually militantly, I would say, anti-Western, at least in its rhetoric today. I mean, every day Erdogan is talking about the plot against Turkey. You know, Joe mentioned the fact that Moody downgraded Turkey's bonds to junk status. Moody does what Moody does. That's part of a plot. Plot by a superior power, which is a code word for the United States. That's what Erdogan said, right? When the constant rhetoric, people are trying to bring down Turkey because it's building one of the largest airports in the world, and people are jealous of what Turkey is doing. That for that, you're trying to, just to stop the airport, you're trying to change the government. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that's being said, but over and over. A friend of mine came back the other day. This is a guy who was an academic here and decided to go back to Turkey, and now is in the process of coming back, you know. And he said to me, he said, look, first of all, he told me, I can't go back. He said, he's here, he said, because he can't stand it anymore. Every night, he said, the television station is just repeating this nonsense, of this conspiracy nonsense. He says he can't breathe anymore. And this is not a guy who, I mean, I've always thought he was a little bit too conservative. I mean, too, should we say, too Kemalist for my liking in his writings and in his political stand. But he just feels he can't survive that anymore, just on a daily basis. So that's, I think, where we are going. I can't tell you where this is going to go because there are too many other factors. I mean, look, what happens in Syria and Iraq is important. What happens to the Turkish economy? The Turkish economy is still in much better shape than most European economies. I mean, the Turks are going to grow by 3% today. I think if you told the French, oh, these guys are going by 3%, they'll be jealous because French growth is 0.2%, if that, right? So there's still a lot of dynamism in the Turkish economy, but the Turks don't have that much influence, impact on the global economy. Nobody does anymore. So a major downturn would really constrain Erdogan's ability to do much. Another 2008-like crisis. Right? United States can weather it better. Europe can weather it, but Turks would be hurt much more. So there are too many unknowns at the moment, right, to be able to say exactly where this is going. But all the indicators are that this anti-Americanism is solidifying and becoming much more, and you're seeing it from people you don't really expect, and that's what I'm surprised. I mean, I expected from a large chunk of the writers and stuff like that. That I don't. I mean, I've been used to reading all these conspiracy theories in the past as well, and all these, but from people that you didn't think were thinking like that. That's to me is what is surprising.
One final question that you didn't get a chance to speak to.
Hold on.
What's the current Turkish government's policy towards Syria? It seems like after the coup that there's been somewhat of a subtle shift in terms of the previous policy of supporting the rebels, trying to topple Assad, focusing now much more on internal Turkish politics, but also the Kurdish question and the desire to play a much more leadership role in terms of shaping the future of Syria has taken somewhat of a step backward. Is that an accurate reading of where Turkey is today?
It's an accurate reading, except that your point of the starting point is wrong. It didn't start with the coup. It started remember I talked about Kobani in October 2014? Until then, the Turkish priority was very clear. Number one and only priority was get rid of Assad. Right, that was the basis of Turkish policy. In fact, there was a major I would say, almost a confrontation between Obama and Erdogan in October of 2013, a year before that, when this is the last time Erdogan came for a state visit to Washington. He was very well received by Obama. Dinner at the White House one night, and Obama confronted him about one very important issue, and that is the foreign fighters that were coming through Turkey. Because Turkey literally opened its borders to the foreign fighters. Government-affiliated NGOs were involved in getting people who landed in Istanbul, bringing them to the border towns, and then transferring them across. And then even today, there is still there's a very strong pro-ISIS infrastructure in Turkey, where ISIS members come back for R&R, so to say, to get their wounds taken care of. ISIS, there's a lot of support for ISIS in Turkey. And it didn't start with support for ISIS, it started with support for Jabhat al-Nusra. And Obama essentially confronted Erdogan saying, Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda, you're supporting Al-Qaeda, you have to stop. And from what I gather, it wasn't, they had really a difference of opinion. And it took a lot of time before the Turks started to shift, but they really did not completely shift because the network still continued to exist, even though they did not maybe get government support. Okay. Then comes October 2014, when this Kobani incident happened and the United States lined itself up with the Syrian Kurds. Now, the Syrian Kurds, you have to understand, it's called the PYD or YPG, depending, were created by the PKK in Turkey. They're not a subsidiary, but they're a sister organization. And many Turkish Kurds fight with the PYD in Syria against ISIS and against the regime. When the United States sided with, in Turkish eyes, two things happened. One, the United States sided with the PKK, even though we tried to make a distinction between the two. But most importantly, Erdogan perceived that the growth, the strengthening of the Syrian Kurds would provide the Turkish Kurds with much better, much greater negotiating position in the peace talks. That's why he wanted this, as I said, he wanted Öcalan and the PKK to stop the advance of the Syrian Kurds, and the PKK refused. You have to understand, for the Turkish Kurds, the Syrian Kurds are the great success story because they understand that they created it. Turkish Kurds have lost since 1923. Every time they've rebelled, they've lost. They've made progress politically, ironically, but militarily, they haven't won. In Syria, they're winning. They're having territory. They have an alliance with the United States. They are seen as the only formidable, credible source fighting ISIS. So the enhancement of the Syrian Kurds is also enhancements for the Turkish Kurds. And that's what Erdogan could not accept, and that's why he broke the negotiations between the PKK and his government, right? So at that moment, priorities changed. And fighting the Kurds in Syria became priority number one, Assad number two, and ISIS number three. Even though ISIS is a threat to Turkey, and ISIS has conducted many bombings in Turkey, very often what ISIS is smart. What they do is, yes, they've done the Turkish airport in Istanbul, but they tend to do events or attacks that increase Turkish-Kurdish polarization in Turkey. So it's kind of a very deliberate policy. But it is a threat to Turkey. But despite that, fighting the Kurds is number one priority. And in fact, you saw the Turks go into Jarablus a month ago, because Jarablus is a town. If you look at the Syrian geography, from the Iraqi border to this town Jarablus, but to the outskirts of Jarablus, the Syrian Kurds control east to west. Then there's a gap, and then the Kurds control the northwestern corner of Syria. What the Kurds would like to do is join that essentially 100 kilometers space. And the Turks are adamant about blocking them. They moved in with their own troops to block that, and now they are supporting the Free Syrian Army, which is taking on both supposedly ISIS, but also the Kurds. So what happens in Syria will very much determine everything, but in terms of priorities, they have completely changed. And this is an issue over which Washington and Ankara see diametrically opposed. And when you read the Turkish press and you read what the Turkish commentators are saying, it is becoming a serious bone of contention.
Yeah, and on that point, might this not be somewhere where Ankara and Moscow are in fact working together? You were a little bit skeptical earlier about the Putin-Erdogan relationship growing, but there's a report in today, in the newspapers today, saying that there is a Turkish-Russian deal that would give Ankara a free hand to deal with Kurdish groups in the north in exchange for cutting support or reducing support to rebels in Aleppo. And that in other words, that Russia will, in exchange for Turkey backing off of its support of the Syrian opposition, and basically, as Nader said, giving up on the anti-Assad struggle, in exchange for which Moscow will help Ankara attack the Kurds. Which is tricky because actually the PYD has also developed a relationship with Moscow as well.
Look, I take all these stories with a huge grain of salt. Putin is supposed to come to see Erdogan or to come to some event in Istanbul. Can they make a deal like this? Yes, but in fact, on the ground, I don't think it will matter because support is going to the Syrian opposition from a whole bunch of different channels, and I think the Turks will not want to stay out of it because if they do, then one day they'll pay a price for it, for making a deal like this. Secondly, the Turkish ability to hit Syrian Kurds is limited in the following sense. The only way they can do it is by introducing a large number of troops into northern Syria. The moment they do that, they're going to get a coalition that will develop against them. And given the state of the Turkish military today, I would not put my money on their ability to take on really a formidable force, which is very good in guerrilla fighting. Look, the Turkish military has, since 1984, trying to defeat the PKK. You read the Turkish paper every day. Every day they kill 10, 15 PKK guys. By that, if you tally that up, 5 million people should have died by now. But, somehow the PKK continues. So I'm not saying that they can't, they can hit the Syrian Kurds and damage them. But you're going to do it at a time when the United States is relying on them to fight ISIS. Imagine the reaction in the American Congress. Here's our chance to take back Raqqa. And the Kurds don't want to do it, by the way. The Kurds have realized that they're being used by the United States as cannon fodder. You have to understand, they took over with the United States' help and coordination. They took the city of Manbij, which is on the way to Raqqa. The number of casualties the Syrian Kurds suffered is enormous given their size. I thought they had lost 300 men and women. I just talked to somebody who came from Turkey who's from the Kurdish political party. He told me it was 800. If that's true, that's really... So the Kurds are basically saying, we don't want to go to Raqqa. There are no Kurds there. We're not going to die for the Americans, right? But if you have any chance of convincing them to participate in the Raqqa operation because there's nobody else, you're not going to let the Turks attack them. And if the Turks were to do something like that, I think the reaction in Washington would be tremendous. Or huge, as somebody would say.